What is up everyone, it's Saber here and welcome to another Naruto What If. If you end up liking the video, please consider subscribing. It's free and you can take it back at any time and it really helps me out, and this is my second channel, so if you want some more what ifs, go check out my other channels. And with all of the YouTube formalities out of the way, let's get into it. Prologue. The once progressive village of Konoha was now a burning wasteland, broken buildings and ruined land everywhere. Nowhere was safe anymore, everything was destroyed. The faces of the 7 Hokage, from the village founder Hashirama Senju to the village hero Naruto Uzumaki, were destroyed to the point where they were scarcely recognizable. The stormy sky was dark and menacing, gusting winds carrying the smoke from the now destroyed homes and workplaces upwards, painting the sky in fire. Not a soul could be seen in the desolate land, and the quiet that surrounded the place felt like time itself was holding its breath for what was yet to come. On the Hokage mountain, two figures fought head-on, their weapons clashing against each other and pushing their owners backward. On the higher ground, a young man with gray eyes and bushy black hair stood tall, his black trench coat billowing in the wind. His body was covered with black lines from his palm to his left eye. He looked down at his opponent. Another young man with spiky blonde hair and 2 whisker marks on each of his cheeks. A large scar marred his right eye, and the wind whipped his black cape behind him just like it caught his own. The blonde held a katana in both his hands as exhaustion forced him into a crouch. His soul blue eyes sent a piercing yet tired look to the man before him as the wind raged around them. "I didn't think you'd go this far, Kawaki." Boruto shouted, the feelings of betrayal running deep within his heart. Kawaki's face remained unchanged as he looked at Boruto from above, his hair moving slowly with the rhythm of the wind. "I'll send you where I sent the 7th Hokage, Boruto," he said with an unwavering voice, almost emotionless. Detached, Boruto ducked his head, blonde fringe hiding the pain and sadness in his eyes. "Was this the only possible outcome?" he asked, not directing the question to anyone in particular. "Yes, that's right." Kawaki clenched his left hand, making a screeching sound that seemed to be coming out of the now red lines that covered his body. "The age of shinobi is over." Boruto's hand entered his pouch. "Even so," he told Kawaki as he tied his forehead protector around his head, revealing 2 intersecting slashes on it. A black line slowly made his way up to his face, to his scarred eye. "I'm still a shinobi." He opened his wounded eye, revealing a light blue iris with a darkened sclera and a barely visible pupil. The black lines covering his right side turned blue as he made a one-handed ram seal, preparing his staff. Kawaki wordlessly charged at Boruto, the latter doing the same with his sword, weapons once again clashing against each other. Atop of the 7th Hokage stone faced, the sound of each strike echoing throughout the destroyed village. On the sidelines, 2 black-haired girls were watching as the boys fought. They had escaped the terror and horrors of the village, adrenaline rushing through their veins, and their focus on the fight was all that was keeping them from breaking down. The older between them stood rigid, her fists clenched as her Sharingan darted all over, capturing every movement the 2 shinobi made. She knew Boruto wanted had to fight this battle alone, but as much as she wanted to allow him that, she also knew that if something were to happen to him and she could have stopped it, she would never forgive herself. After the death of both her parents, he was the only family she had left. Her eyes glanced at the girl beside her for a brief moment before returning to the fight at hand. He was the only family they both had left. Himawari's face was covered in dirt, her clothes dirty and ripped. Sarada was sure she didn't look much better than her own body littered with cuts and wounds. She was straining to see anything with how dirty her glasses were. Tear trails still stained her cheeks, but she couldn't care less. Her chakra was draining quickly with her Sharingan activated, but she didn't deactivate it. She had to be prepared for anything. Himawari tugged on her arm, momentarily pulling her attention away from the fight. "We have to help Oniai-chan," she told Sarada, tears in her eyes. "He's hurt." Sarada's fist clenched even more than they already were, blood starting to trickle out from where her nails dug into the palm of her hand. "We can't," she told the young girl. "It's a fight, only he can fight. If we were to intervene, it could make things even worse." She hated this, and she knew the Uzumaki girl hated it just as much, but she had to think logically and rationally. Feelings couldn't be a factor in this equation. Meanwhile, Boruto charged at Kawaki with his weapon raised, crashing against his opponent's staff and making sparks fly. He knew his sister and teammate were near, and the worry was only growing as he heard Himawari's voice progressively grow louder and louder. It meant she was nearing a breaking point, and nothing good ever came out of that. When it came to his sister, "I have to finish this quickly before she does something reckless," he thought as he slashed at his former friend, only to be blocked again. Something was tugging at his Jogan, almost making him lose focus on the battle. He knew what this tug meant and tried to spread out his senses to find the cause. He located a dimension barrier a mere few feet away from him, and the barrier was getting thinner and thinner by the second. Boruto knew that if he got too close to the barrier, his Jogan would automatically break it, opening up the dimension. He couldn't let that happen. He had to stay as far away from it as possible, at least until the fight was over. Assuming he won, too bad. Fate had other plans that day. Taking advantage of Sarada's focus on the battle at hand, Himawari rushed ahead. Byakugan activated. Himawari, wait! Sarada shouted, charging after her. Hearing Himawari's name caused both boys to freeze in place and turn their heads to the girl running towards them. Everything seemed to slow down at that moment. It took Boruto less than a second to predict what will happen next. Himawari would charge at Kawaki, who would instinctively raise his staff in defense, which would catch her mid-air and send her flying from the mountain, resulting in her getting gravely wounded. He couldn't let that happen. He launched forward, using Kawaki's momentarily distraction as an advantage, and grabbed Himawari mid-charge, using his body weight to push her back to where Sarada was, and the barrier shit was his only thought, as his Jogan sent a pulse to the barrier, activating it and generating a black vortex underneath him. He felt himself getting sucked in together with Himawari, who was still in his arms. He heard her scream in fear, mingling with Sarada's surprised shout as she tumbled into the vortex as well. He turned his body so that Himawari will be on top of him while they fell. Closing his eyes, he awaited the collision with the bottom of wherever this dimension is. It didn't take too long to reach it, and he crashed into what felt like a smooth marble floor, hitting the back of his head and stealing his breath away. The shock making him release Himawari from his grasp. Darkness was enveloping him, forcing him to close his eyes and slip into unconsciousness as he heard the sound of another body falling near him before his senses shut down, and he fell into the dark. He thought of his family, his mother and father, and wondered if he'll get to see them soon. Maybe he'll see his master and his friends as well. Unknown to him, fate had other plans for him, bigger than anything he had ever known. Time skip. The first thing Boruto noticed was the pain out. He was not laying in a comfortable position, to say the least. Something long was poking him in the back. His eyes were still closed. Well, one was still closed, the other was always closed. The back of his head was pretty sore, which was probably what was making him feel so foggy and drowsy. He could have sworn he hit it somewhere, but where? His good eye shot open. Kawaki battle, black vortex, Himawari and Sarada. He shot up like he was struck by lightning, a big mistake on his part, as he immediately winced as a sharp jolt of pain reminded him of his injuries. Scanning his surroundings, it didn't seem like he was in Konoha anymore. Instead, he was in a small clearing in the woods. Another glance around him explained what he felt pressed against his back. He was lying under a tree on top of its roots, which were pressed up against his back, causing the discomfort. There was no one else but him around, which made him both relieved and nervous. He knew Sarada and Himawari had fallen through the vortex with him, but it seemed like they didn't end up in the same place. That also raised the question, where was he exactly? He knew he was in some kind of forest, which made him hope that the portal hadn't transported him too far from the fire country, or better yet, Konoha. The trees were huddled very closely together and had dark and light leaves on all of the branches, and immediate sign he wasn't in Suna, since nothing this green could grow there. It also didn't seem like Iwa, since the ground was covered in way too much grass and way too few rocks. Checking his gear, everything was accounted for, from kunai to shuriken. Checking the sheath of his katana, he panicked for a moment when the sword wasn't there, only to immediately relax when he found it lying next to him. Getting up, he sheathed the sword back to its place and looked around. He had no idea where to go. Himawari and Sarada were out there somewhere, but he had no clue on how to even start looking for them. He could scan the forest for days in one direction, only for them to be on the opposite side from him. A good way to start would be to see how far the forest goes, but he had little to no chakra left. The journey through the portal draining him. Besides, it was darkening quickly. The last rays of the sun, slowly disappearing behind the tree-lined dark clouds, were filling the sky and blocking the sunlight completely, making a low grumble as they clashed with one another. It would rain soon. He'd better find cover and start planning on how to find his sister and teammate before they stayed out too long in the rain and caught a cold. Taking a step forward, he wobbled and had to lean his hand on the tree behind him to not fall. Cursing under his breath, he concentrated on trying to apply all his weight on his legs, slowly checking if he could stand on his own. The rain started to pour down, large droplets of water falling through the branches and leaves onto his hair, his face and his clothes. When he finally managed to steady himself, the rain had rendered his clothes a second skin clinging to his body. He knew he had to hurry, or else Himawari and Sarada might wander off in a certain direction to avoid the downpour and get even farther away from him. He started to walk slowly, his hands sliding against the tree trunks he passed as he made his way in a random direction, seeing as it was the one with fewer trees than the others, meaning he could move much quicker even in his condition, straining his sight to see anything in the almost dark forest. He tripped over a tree root or a small stone a few times, too focused on what was ahead to look down. The 7th time he tripped wasn't because of a tree root or a rock. His eye flashed over the thing that caused his fall, a yellow hoodie, lavender-colored hair, and a pink skirt. He fell over his little sister's unconscious body. Boruto called out, surprised. She was lying on the base of a tree and was shockingly pretty dry. Glancing up, he noticed that the branches of the tree were much closer together than the other trees, making it harder for the rain to penetrate through them. He crouched down, ignoring the searing pain from his ribcage. He probably had some broken ribs, not that he cared at the moment. With a bit of effort he settled Himawari with her back against the tree, and examined her in the dim moonlight cracking through the clouds. She was wounded, her arms and legs filled with cuts and bruises. Boruto was no medic, but he deduced that she had at least one fractured rib, maybe two, as her somewhat ripped hoodie and undershirt revealed a bruised torso. Some areas of the skin were definitely darker than her usual tone, and a few already healing cuts had dried up, trails of blood coming from them. That knowledge made him grit his teeth in anger. Himawari was his precious little sister. He knew she was a powerhouse and a monster when she wanted to be, and she definitely did not need his protection, but he couldn't help it. She would always be his cute little sister, and the fact that she got hurt sent him spiraling into a dark place he tried to avoid ever since his master died. No, he mentally smacked himself. Not now. Hima's hurt, and you need to focus on the task at hand, focus on the mission ahead. Hima now spiraling. Later he removed his cloak from his back and wrung out water. Deciding it was dry enough, he wrapped his sister with it, making sure she was tucked in well as she slept. Checking on his chakra reserves, he had enough to make one shadow clone a quick hand sign, and another. He appeared. They shared a quick look before the clone nodded curtly and turned his attention to Himawari. Knowing that Himawari was now safely guarded by one of his clones, he leaned his forehead against hers and took a deep, slightly agonizing breath. Feeling a bit more relaxed, he kissed the top of her head. Getting up, he nodded to the shadow clone. Start a fire once the rain lets up. We need to get her warm, he told the clone. The clone nodded, a solemn expression on his face as he turned his gaze back to the original sister. Bracing himself, Boruto turned around and started making his way back into the forest, finally more energized since he had more chakra now and not as sore as before. He switched from a slow limp into a run, moving much quicker between the trees and scanning the forest for his Uchiha teammate. Half an hour later the rain started to let up, letting more moonlight shine through the treetops and allowing Boruto to see more. He still hadn't found any sign of Sarada anywhere, which made him more and more concerned by the minute. Did he make a wrong turn? What if he passed her because it was too dark to see? What if she was hurt? The last question made him more anxious than others. Sarada might have been a highly skilled medical trained by her mother on the art of healing, and a very calm under fire person, but she always had a habit of healing everybody else first before even thinking about healing herself, a habit Auntie Sakura had mentioned was no good and that she should get rid of it. So knowing his teammate, even if she was hurt, assuming she was awake, she'd look for him and Himawari to check if they were injured before even thinking to take a look at herself. Jumping onto a branch, he stopped to rest, leaning against the tree and catching his breath. Suddenly he could see much clearer. Looking up, he saw that the moon had broken through the clouds and now was shining down on him. He remembered once when they were coming back to the village after a mission, Sarada had mentioned something about the moon. They'd been tired but satisfied the mission had been a success and they were finally returning home after 4 days away. Konohamaru-sensei had been talking with Mitsuki, who'd wanted to get the day off the day after tomorrow since he and his girlfriend had a date planned. Boruto'd always found it amusing seeing Mitsuki act like a boyfriend, as the guy he'd known ever since they were 8 had always been such a socially awkward person. He'd mentioned it to Sarada, who had just shrugged it off by saying he's growing up, we all are. They'd been walking a bit ahead of the others, the moonlight looming on their backs. Sarada had a content smile on her face and looked peaceful. Boruto had been staring at her face for a while as they walked, gaining her attention. What is it? She asked him, breaking him out of his trance. It's just you seem sorta calm. I don't know, peaceful maybe. He felt flustered from the way her eyes scanned his face. She had probably deemed him sincere since she visibly relaxed from her almost tense posture, her shoulders slacking and back leaning a bit. I guess it's the moonlight, it always made me feel secure, she said after a long pause, startling Boruto as he thought he might have pissed her off with his comment. How come? She'd pushed up her glasses and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. She'd been growing out her hair and it was already past her shoulders. When I was young, before I met my dad, my mama used to say that if I looked at the moon I'd be connected to Papa through it. Her expression had changed into a fond one as she talked about her parents. She said that it's because he's probably looking at the moon as well, and if we both looked at it it would connect us. She'd glanced at the moon smiling. I guess when I'm under the moon it makes me feel like my papa is watching over me. She had shaken her head, casting a glance in Boruto's direction. You probably think this boring, right? She'd stopped when she'd noticed the look he'd been giving her. His cheeks were hot and he wore a bewildered expression like he was just seeing her for the first time. Through his unbreaking gaze he noticed her cheeks started to flush and she licked her lips, as if her throat was dry. Boruto remembered staring at his teammate with awe. He'd asked her a question he'd pegged as silly and meaningless, yet she'd given him a meaningful and beautiful answer, revealing a soft side she rarely ever showed under the moonlight. With her onyx eyes reflecting the shine of the moon and the light breeze around them messing her hair and the soft expression she had, he'd thought one thing: she was beautiful, and that thought had brought warmth to his face and a new realization to his heart, something that had seemed so impossible yet so normal. He couldn't do anything but stare at her face while his mind processed this new revaluation. Smiling fondly at the memory, he chuckled before shaking his head to clear out those thoughts. This was not the time for a trip down memory lane. As enjoyable as it might have been, he had a mission to accomplish. Grabbing a kunai, he marked the tree he was standing on with an X before jumping off the branch to the next one and the next one. At the fourth he stopped, marking it again with an X before moving on. Every 4 trees he stopped and marked his path. 10 minutes later he noticed the trees seemed to have more space between them, and the farther he went the more spaced out they became. I must be nearing the end of the forest, he realized, contemplating whether to go back and look for Sarada. Elsewhere the moon reappeared, its light shining through the thin line of trees at the end of the forest. I wonder. Boruto had a suspicion and decided to check out the trees ahead before heading back. Jumping off the branch he stood on, he made his way on foot to where the moon shone. Passing through some bushes he saw her laying on the ground at the edge of the forest, the moonlight shining above her. Was Sarada Uchiha, and she seemed to be both wet and unconscious. Boruto let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Launching towards her he grabbed her arms, only to be alarmed at how cold they were. Not good, she wasn't dressed for cold weather. He took off his jacket and put it on her. At least it would keep her warm until he could return to Himawari and his clone. Hopefully his sister had woken up since he'd left, or at the very least gotten warmer. He loaded Sarada onto his back, making sure she wouldn't fall off even if he jumped. Well, time to head back. It must have been around midnight when Boruto finally reached Himawari. His younger sister was still asleep, and the shadow clone he'd left guarding her stood on a branch above her, scanning for danger. He'd lit a fire, though placing Sarada carefully next to Himawari. He checked the latter's temperature. It'd be bad if either of them caught a cold in the middle of nowhere. Himawari seemed to be more than fine. It seemed she had moved from unconsciousness to sleep while he'd been gone. Kicking off his cloak in the process, the thing was completely dry and quite warm, so Boruto wrapped himself back up with it. He sat under the tree next to them, watching as they breathed in and out. For a while he felt the tiredness finally getting to him and realized what an eventful day he'd been through today. But even in his tired state, not allowing the full realization sink in, because letting that sink in meant letting the grief take control, and he couldn't break right now. He needed to be strong for the girls, he needed to be strong for himself. Signaling the shadow clone to come down, he gave the simple order of scanning the forest to find out where they were and to then dispel and relay the information back to himself. Once the shadow clone took off, Boruto got up from his position and checked one last time on the others. They both seemed content and at ease. Finally at peace, he let a big yawn escape his mouth and rubbed his eyes mindlessly. Getting back to his spot, he wrapped himself up in the cloak like a blanket and closed his eyes, allowing sleep to take hold and drag him into the sweet, sweet darkness. The moon veiled over the small campsite, as if protecting it from the dark. Somewhere not too far from there, it also shone on a village and a mountain with 5 huge stone faces on it. Time skip. Boruto woke up to the sound of birds chirping. Sitting up from his fallen position, he stretched his arms, yawned, and rubbed his eye. It seemed that the fire had died down during the night, leaving nothing more than a small circle of charcoal in the middle where the flames had been. Glancing at the 2 sleeping girls, he saw that they were still asleep. Seriously, how can someone sleep so much? He wondered out loud. He shook his cloak out to get the morning dew out of it. A quick glance at the sun's position told him that it was around 10 a.m. It seemed he'd slept for around 10 hours, give or take. The girls should be awake soon, as well as even on a good day. Himawari never slept more than 11 hours. She said that she felt that if she slept too much she would miss the whole day, and Sarada was never one to oversleep. She was usually up with the dawn and breaking into his room to kick him out of Bad should he oversleep. Chuckling at the memory, he hung his cloak upon a lower branch to dry in the sun and then went over to the sleeping Uchiha. She seemed pretty peaceful, all things considered, and not at all like Himawari, who was mumbling incoherent things and moving around in her sleep. Boruto felt his smile grow bigger as he watched his little sister fondly. She seemed to be having a nice dream as he caught the words ice cream pandas and surprisingly hot pepper. Seriously, his sister was a wonder. Turning his attention to his teammate, he noticed that she was sweating lightly. She was probably feeling too hot with his jacket on, so he took it off her. It was battered and dirty, and the right sleeve was ripped from the wrist to the elbow. He'd have to ask Himawari to fix it for him later. Putting it on, he felt something like assurance washing over him. This jacket had been through a lot with him, and no matter how battered and torn it was from all the battle, he wore it like a battle scar, proof that he fought those battles and won, that he could do so again, that he could protect his sister and friend no matter how many scars he'd get along the way. It was a memento, and he'd need it to remind him that he could do this no matter what. Getting up from his crouched position, he looked around. His shadow clone still hadn't returned or dispelled, which was strange. It had been 10 hours. Where the hell did he go? If he'd gotten lost, he would have already dispelled and sent the memories back to the original. Where the hell was his shadow clone? The road was quiet. It was not smooth by any means, but for a veteran merchant it was all in a day's work. A wagon made its way slowly down the trail, one lone donkey pulling it. The man leading the donkey looked like he was a lovely chipper fellow. An old merchant was sitting in the front enjoying the morning sun and humming to himself. Looking behind his shoulder, he watched the little girl sitting in the back playing with the flowers she'd picked earlier. "Having fun, Zari?" he asked the girl, smiling. The girl looked up. Her brown hair, tied up into 2 pigtails, bounced with every turn of her head. "Yup, the flowers here are so pretty." His gray eyes shone brightly as she laughed, lifting one of the flower crowns she made to show her father. "I'm glad you're enjoying yourself, dear." He smiled at her before turning his head back to the road. "We'll arrive at Konoha soon, so you just relax." Zari giggled as she pressed another flower to the crown case. She couldn't wait to arrive at Konoha. There was an amazing flower shop there, and she'd saved up her money the whole year so she could spend it there. Her mother had been very supportive of her goal, giving her rewards for jobs she did around the house and helping her learn more about flowers. She couldn't wait to come home with the beautiful bouquet she would organize and give to her mother, who had fallen under the weather and couldn't make the trip with them this year. Her father, Graf, wiped the sweat off his face with a handkerchief. Something felt wrong for him. After so many years in the merchandise business, he had learned to trust his gut, and right now it was telling him someone was watching him, but he didn't see anybody. It made him anxious. Unknown to him, someone was watching him. Several someones, in fact, though the first few people watching them from the shadows were not aware of the other spectator. He was aware of them. Walking backward quietly, he dispelled himself to send his memories back to the original. The merchant and his daughter were going to need help, and soon. Boruto was carrying both girls on his back, and they were heavy, though he would never say it to their face since that would probably get him punched in the face. He shivered. Girls were scary. Sarada's weight wasn't much of a surprise considering she was a 16-year-old girl, but Himawari was a shock to him. When had she gotten this big? It made him kinda proud, though a bit worried. The more she grew, the prettier she got. He and his dad knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed her and tried to approach her. They definitely couldn't let that happen. Alana, Himawari's best friend, used to shrug off Boruto and Naruto's concerns by saying that Himawari was a smart girl, and even better than that, a strong one. If someone were to try and do something to her that was not to her liking, she'd probably tenketsu the shit out of them before they'd even get close to her. Though after saying that, Alana did say that if someone were to try and touch Himawari, she would personally rip their limbs off one by one. That day, Boruto and his father decided that Himawari could take of herself, and to also make sure that Alana will never encounter anyone Himawari will ever date. His arms were kinda sore, and the cloak he folded and stuck in the inner pocket of his jacket was pressing kinda uncomfortably against his chest. His ribs were aching, and he was low on chakra, being way too tired yesterday to even realize how much he actually spent on that one clone. Speaking of that clone, he still hadn't come back yet. Boruto decided to start making his way with the girls on his back in the direction his clone ran off to. Maybe he'd see what's holding it up while going that road, and maybe find some food as well. Wait a minute, a thought crossed his mind. Didn't Sarada tell you she always carries soldier pill in her pouch? He knelt down and laid the girls on the grass beside him, gently lifting Sarada up into a sitting position. He allowed her to fall on his chest as he checked her back pouch and hit the jackpot as he found 2 small pills in there. Quickly swallowing them, he felt they'd already started to work. Reloading the girls onto his back, he made his way through the forest, the sun getting higher and higher in the sky as he strolled down the unmarked path. Sarada stirred up for a moment, making Boruto freeze. Is she waking up? He glanced at his teammate, and waited. Apparently she was just shifting her position a little before going back to sleep. Boruto sighed. This was going to be a long day. About 10 minutes later he stumbled out of the woods onto a road. The ground was dense, streaked with tracks of humans and wheels on it. Now he had a dilemma. Right or left? There were several footsteps, tracks in both directions. No matter which direction he chose, he'd likely end up in civilization. So where should he go? Above his head a hawk screeched, brown and majestic. When Boruto made eye contact with it for a moment, the hawk turned his gaze and flew to Boruto's right as if signaling him to follow it. Now that he thought about it, didn't Sasuke-san have a hawk that looked just like this one watching over your daughter even beyond the grave? Boruto said to himself. Don't worry, master, I'm going to look after her from now on, I promise. He began to walk down the road after the hawk, smiling, newly reminded he was not alone. The hawk flew away to the sky, far away into the clouds, perhaps returning back to his master's side until he will soar again, wondering where the road would take him. Boruto tried to entertain himself by humming songs and solving riddles so boring. Sarada shifted on his back every now and then while Himawari was in a constantly mumbling unintelligible words. Just when he'd started to wish for some excitement, he realized the old adage was true. Be careful what you wish for. The clone's memories rushed back into him, halting Boruto's steps. Apparently while on his surveillance of the woods, his clone had found a father and a daughter who were merchants on their way to a village. He decided to follow them and find the village so he could send directions to the original. Along with the merchants, the clone had detected 4 other presences around the wagon. 4 ill intentions. He decided to conceal his presence and keep watch in case the others attempted to harm the merchants. Hours later he heard the 4 talking about attacking soon, planning to strike before the wagon arrived into the village. That was when he dispelled himself to let the original know. Boruto let all of the memories wash over him, tracing the path the clone took. Surprisingly, he'd gone the same way Boruto had already been heading. In fact, the wagon would not be that much farther from him according to his clone's memories. Speeding up his pace, Boruto ran ahead, determined to get to the wagon before the 4 bandits attacked. It didn't take long for him to hear shouting ahead of him. Moving from the road to some nearby bushes, he laid both girls on the ground next to him where they would be hidden out of sight. Sarada moved again, her eyelids stirring, but didn't make noise, making sure she was asleep. He then turned and watched the happenings in front of him. An old man and a little girl stood in front of a wagon, the man holding the girl in a protective embrace. 4 men stood in front of them, kunai and knives visible. Clearly for intimidation purposes, they laughed as 2 of them were looted the wagon. The little girl was shaking in fear, tears in her eyes. Boruto gritted his teeth. Seriously, who would do that to a poor little girl and a harmless old man? One of the bandits picked up a small money sack. Well, looky what we got here. He dangled the sack in front of the father and daughter. How kind of you, I was running short on gambling money. He laughed at the old man's angered expression. No, the little girl yelled, that's my mine, I saved it up all by myself, so give it back. She escaped her father's hold and ran to the bandit, grabbing onto his leg. The man's face scrunched up in disgust and he shook his leg. Hey, let go of me, you little brat. No, give me my money back. Mommy helped me save it up and I have to buy flowers for her with it, the girl cried as she held onto the man's trousers, not letting go. The man got annoyed, ripping her away from his pants and slamming her against the wagon. Her body fell down unconscious. Zari, her father, immediately picked her body up and held it protectively in his arms. You monster. She was the one who was clinging to me, you stupid old man, the bandit said. He picked through the small money sack, clicking his tongue in anger and throwing it on the ground, money spreading everywhere. Tch, there isn't enough money in there to buy a decent drink, he complained. Hey, don't you have any money, you old shit? He kicked the old merchant once, twice, thrice. Come on, aren't you a merchant or something? Give us money. He kicked the man again as his friends snickered. Boruto's blood-boiled fists clenched so hard his nails dug into his flesh he couldn't move, yet the element of surprise not on his side. He didn't have enough chakra to make another clone just yet, and definitely not enough for using jutsus. You know, that girl looks pretty healthy, one of the bandits' friends said, examining the unconscious girl in the merchant's arms. I bet she could sell for some good money in the slave market. That sent the other 3 snickering, their faces forming sadistic grins. Screw the element of surprise. Boruto jumped out of the bushes, unsheathing his katana and heading to the bandit near him. He quickly slashed his back, kicking him to the ground. The other 3 turned around at the noise, eyes widening. Hey, one of them yelled as he ran towards Boruto with his knife raised to strike. Boruto crouched down, narrowly avoiding the blow, and used his momentum to punch the man in the gut, knocking the bandit's breath out of him. Laying one hand on the ground, he kicked the bandit in the side, flinging him a good few feet away. The other bandit threw a kunai at him, barely grazing his shoulder. Boruto swiftly got up and made a quick hand sign, releasing lightning down his blade. He slashed horizontally, cutting the kunai throwing bandit down and electrocuting him, the one who'd kicked the little girl. seemed the smartest out of their bunch, seeing as he was the only one who actually took a second to measure Boruto up instead of attacking him without a plan. The man's eyes darted towards the merchant and girl, and Boruto's eyes widened when he realized the bandit's plan, diving to get them but not being fast enough. The bandit got to them first, holding the now wide-awake little girl in his arms and pointing a knife at her throat. "Zari!" her father cried out. Boruto halted, knowing that he was now at the mercy of the filthy bandit. He tightened his hold on the hilt of his katana, frozen and placed. The bandit smirked victoriously. "Not so heroic now, are we, Daddy?" Zari cried. The bandit pressed his knife further up her throat. "Quiet, you little brat." Boruto's jaw clenched. He had drained out chakra and running on pure adrenaline. There was no way he could help the little girl. "I see you lost that heroic spark of yours now, boy." The bandit snickered. "Serves you right for thinking you could beat me, the mighty Ulrich." He laughed out loud. Silent tears were coming out of Zari's eyes as she struggled against the bandit's hold. Suddenly she bit his arm hard. Ulrich released her in a yelp of pain, and she fell to the ground at his feet. "Ow, you little bitch!" Ulrich spat. "I'll kill you." He launched forward, knife at the ready. "Zari!" her father yelled. Boruto darted forward, though he knew full well he wouldn't be fast enough to reach them in time. Shinaro, a fist came crashing down from above directly into Ulrich's face, sending him flying into a nearby tree. Where he'd stood seconds ago now stood a seething Sarada Sharingan, activated and fists clenched. She was in a fighting stance, hands raised and feet at hip width. Her glasses shone in the sunlight and her hair was still flowing from her previous attack. Her face was fearsome as she stared at the bandit with pure hatred in her Sharingan eyes, her face twisting into a disgusted expression. Boruto sighed in relief. Not only was the little girl safe, but Sarada was up and already kicking ass. He felt like laughing. "Zari!" The girl's father ran to her and scooped her in his arms, giving her a bone-crushing hug. "I'm so glad you're safe, so glad," they both cried as they held each other. Boruto smiled at that family moment in front of him before turning his attention to a certain Uchiha girl who made her way to him. "Welcome back to the world of the living," he told Sarada. She rolled her eyes at him and scanned the scenery. "Where are we to know? I woke up in a forest after we fell through that vortex. You and Himawari were both asleep for almost 12 hours. Sarada nodded. Kawaki, he shook his head. "I don't think he made the trip with us wherever we are." A thought suddenly crossed his mind. "Wait, if you're awake, does that mean Himawari is also?" Sarada shook her head. "Nope, only me." She gestured to the bandits. "So what do you want to do with them? You can probably hand them over to the local authorities," the old man told them as he neared them with his daughter in tow. "I don't mind giving you a ride." He pointed at his wagon. "It's the least I could do for you after you two saved us." Sarada smiled at him. "That would be nice." "Where are you headed?" "We're going to Kanahagakure, ma'am," the little girl told her excitedly. Boruto and Sarada's eyes widened. "You can't." Boruto told them. "It's nothing but a wasteland." Were they that close to the village? Boruto thought about Kawaki, who might still be there. To their surprise, the old merchant just laughed. "A wasteland? Well, I admit it's not the cleanest place, but I wouldn't call it that." Even Zari giggled at Boruto's words. "In any case, I really don't mind giving you a ride there, and to hand those guys over as well." Boruto was still confused over why they laughed at his words, but Sarada was quick to recover from the confusion and decided to play along with them. "For now, we would be grateful if you could give us a ride, but we have another friend with us. She's a really heavy sleeper. Would you mind if we brought her too?" she asked the merchant. He waved her off. "Sure thing, miss, just put her in the back." He began to grab the things the bandits unloaded from the wagon and loaded it back on it. Boruto gave him a hand while Sarada went to get Himawari. Zari meanwhile bent down to pick the money the bandit threw on the ground earlier and placed it back in her small sack. Boruto and the merchant tied up the bandits in the meanwhile and placed them in the back of the wagon before going back to loading the rest of the merchandise on. Sarada came back with Himawari on her back, still asleep. Boruto finished loading the last bit of merchandise and helped Sarada lift Himawari up and place her on the covered wagon floor. Sarada helped Zari climb in as well and closed the small door behind her. The three of them sitting together in the back while Zari's father, whose name was Graf, sat on the front of the wagon guiding the donkey to Konoha. Zari chatted with Sarada nonstop, complimenting her earlier punch and telling them about her plans on buying flowers with her money for her sick mother back home. Sarada smiled at that, but couldn't help but send a worried glance over to Boruto. Graf and Zari had both said Konoha was fine, but less than 24 hours ago it had been a burning wasteland. What was going on? "So what's her name?" Zari pointed at Himawari's sleeping form. "Oh, that's my little sister Himawari," Boruto told the girl. Zari's eyes filled with wonder and curiosity like the sunflower. "Yup, exactly like it." "Wow, oh, hold on for a sec." Zari dug through the packages in the back, carefully staying on the opposite side of the tied up bandits. "There it is, my flower bag." She pulled out a stuffed bag filled with all sorts of flowers. Digging through it, she pulled out a single sunflower, pulling out a pair of scissors as well. She trimmed the flower's long stalk to no longer than her fist and carefully placed the sunflower in Himawari's hair. There, now everyone will know she has such a pretty name. Boruto couldn't help but smile at that sweet gesture. That girl was definitely cute. She reminded him of Himawari when she was her age. He thought back on those times, sinking into nostalgia as the wagon made its way down the road to an intact and well Konoha. Apparently, hey Mr. Zari's voice attracted his attention. What are you most excited about seeing in Konoha when we get there? I want to see the 5 huge stone faces. She waved her arms to stress the huge part. Boruto shook his head. We already told you Konoha is dangerous right now. You shouldn't. He stopped mid-sentence and stared at the girl. Did you just say 5 faces? Zari tilted her head in confusion. Yeah, the 5 faces of the Hokage. Duh, everyone knows that. She explained it to him like he was an idiot. Boruto and Sarada exchanged a glance. The last time they'd checked, there were 7 faces on the mountain of Konoha, not 5. True, last time they'd checked, those faces had been blown up and falling apart, but there had still been 7 at least since they'd been born. Himawari made a cute noise in her sleep as she turned and tossed around. Sarada had checked on her when they boarded the wagon. She was fine, and it seemed that Boruto's theory about the broken ribs was wrong. Boruto smiled as he watched his little sister sleep blissfully. Zari was chatting with Sarada again, making flower crowns with the flowers from her bag and placing one made out of cherry blossom branches and flowers on top of Sarada's head. The sight of a slightly blushing Sarada with a flower crown on her head was enough for Boruto to break out in laughter. Sarada immediately punched him in the face, nearly knocking him out. Zari laughed at that while Boruto pouted. Himawari slept. Graph made some comments about the view. Zari chatted about her favorite things in her village. Sarada learned how to make flower crowns. Boruto napped for a bit. Himawari slept. They stopped for lunch. Boruto and Sarada practically inhaled their food. Zari and Graph laughed at their behavior. Himawari still slept. They finished lunch and got back to the wagon. Zari napped next to a still sleeping Himawari. Boruto watched the passing scenery, making a flower crown with leftover flowers Zari left on the floor of the wagon as Sarada napped against his shoulder. He thought about what Zari had said. If what she'd said about there being 5 stone faces on the Konoha mountain was true, no, he couldn't let himself think like that. His hands absent-mindedly worked on the flower crown, bending the flower stalks, pulling and tying. He thought about flowers. His mother loved those, and so had his father once. Hinata had told Boruto of the small garden his father used to have on his balcony. When Boruto had asked his mother how she knew that since his father mentioned his gardening hobby was a secret, Hinata's face reddened and she quickly changed the subject. He smiled at the memory. His mother had always been a source of comfort for him. She was the strongest person he knew, enduring years of loneliness when his father worked late, never complaining, and always making his and Himawari's needs as a priority, not caring about her own. He thought about the meaning of her name, a place in the sun. Himawari's name was a play on that meaning, and his father had always been proud of the fact he'd come up with that little wordplay. Their last name, Uzumaki, meant sunshine. Boruto honestly couldn't imagine a better name for his mother than that. It fit her character so well. She was a warm person and seemed to always warm others. When Kawaki had first arrived at their home, he had a hard time fitting in with their family, but she didn't let him feel out of place. She'd made extra efforts to break down his walls, comforting him when he had nightmares during his time with Jigen and Kara, making him hot chocolate whenever he wanted. After she found out about his sweet tooth, he'd really liked her cooking and even helped her out in the kitchen from time to time without her asking him to. Himawari took a lot after their mother as well, warming up to Kawaki early on, easily forgiving him for having broken her vase and being nothing but accepting of both his strengths and weaknesses. Boruto sometimes suspected there might have been something more between the two but never confirmed it, and honestly he eventually came to admit that as long as his younger sister was happy he'd support her. Not that it was hard to please the girl, as she would smile and cherish every small moment in her small world. Alana, her best friend, used to say that that's what attracted her to Himawari in the first place, the warmth and happiness that just radiated out of the lavender-haired girl in waves. They said sunflowers always faced the sun and only bloomed in the sunshine. Boruto had a different opinion. In his perspective, the sun made a conscious effort to face the sunflower, as it always smiled when the sun's light warmed it. The flower crown was complete. It was a mix of white lilies, yellow daisies, and sunflower stalks. Apparently he'd subconsciously chosen flowers that reminded him of his family. He smiled as he ran his fingers across the flowers. He did a much better job than he'd anticipated. Next to him, Sarada stirred, slowly removing her head from his shoulder. Boruto, why are you crying? She hadn't expected him to break down in front of them even if they were sleeping. Boruto touched his cheek, surprised to feel it wet from tear trails. He wiped the tears away and took a deep breath. Not yet, he told himself, I can't cry just yet. Here he placed the flower crown he made on her head on top of the one Zari'd made for her. Now you have two. He fixed it a bit, making sure it was stable. His fingers lingered in her hair a moment longer before he retracted his hand back to his side. Sarada's cheeks were tinged red and she didn't make any eye contact with him. Boruto chuckled at her embarrassment. He found it adorable. Next to them, Zari also stirred, slowly waking up and rubbing her eyes groggily. Morning, she said. Morning, honey. Sleep well? Graf asked. She nodded and climbed over the many boxes and crates that separated the covered wagon from the bench where the driver sat, sitting next to her father. She looked ahead at the road, her eyes widening in amazement. She gasped, "Wah, is that Konoha?" The man smiled at her. "That's right, sweetie, we're almost there." He turned to Boruto and Sarada. "Might want to try and wake her up before we get to the gates. Oh, and the bandits can't wait to get rid of them and hand them to the shinobi at the gate." Boruto and Sarada's brows furrowed. Why would the two merchants be excited about Konoha? It should look like a war zone, not a sunny warm place. But the boxes and merchandise were blocking their view of the front, and they couldn't see what Zari and Graf were looking at. The fleeting memory of Zari mentioning the 5 stone faces came to Boruto's mind before he dismissed it. There was no way what he was thinking was true. That would be stupid and dumb and stupid and hope-inspiring. No, it's stupid. Boruto harshly thought. He couldn't get his hopes up, not right now. The wagon came to a halt and Boruto looked at Sarada. No matter what happened now, they had to stick together and protect Himawari. After getting off the wagon, Boruto offered his hand to Sarada and helped her off. They grabbed the unconscious bandits from the back and placed them on the ground. They exchanged looks and nodded, looking up. Their eyes widened in shock and their jaws dropped as they tried to comprehend what they were looking at. In front of them stood large and tall, green as ever, the gates of Konoha and beyond. Those was the village, though not exactly as they knew it. There was no doubt it was it. Gulping, Sarada grabbed Boruto's arm, shakily pointing at the Hokage faces. Boruto slowly looked up, all of his body telling him it couldn't be true, that he must be dreaming, but his eyes couldn't be lying to him. On the mountainside were the Hokage faces, 5 of them. The last time that had been the case was 18 years ago. Boruto, Sarada, and Himawari were in the past. Disbelief struck them hard. They truly were in the past, weren't they? The Konoha of 18 years ago. How could this happen? Sarada whispered, her grasp at Boruto's arm tightening. I mean, sure, in theory time travel was always a possibility, but to actually experience it is. She was at a loss for words. Boruto nodded, still staring at the Hokage faces on the mountain. His grandfather's face was up there near Granny Tsunade's face, but there were no 6th or 7th faces. It felt odd. He'd grown up looking at those 2 other heads on the mountain. Hell, he'd fought on top of his father's rocky face less than a day ago. And now it wasn't there, gone without a trace. No, he told himself, you're losing focus. Remember, you're technically in an unfamiliar environment. Stay rational and level-headed. You can spiral later. Sometimes Boruto wished he hadn't spent all that time with his master, as he was pretty sure that was the Uchiha patriarch voice he had just heard. But that voice was right either way. No time for losing it now. He had to focus on Himawari, who was still sleeping. He should probably take her to the hospital for a checkup, but how was he going to explain the fact that she was blood-related to both Naruto Uzumaki and the Hyuga clan, and Sarada? She was an Uchiha in a world that currently only had 2 of them right now. If they did a simple DNA test on her, it would raise all kinds of red flags. He needed someone he could trust on the inside, someone with enough authority to make sure no one bothered them, but also someone to whom he was close enough to make sure their secret wouldn't get out. He didn't think it would be good for people to know that they were time travelers from the future. That would make things a lot harder in an already difficult situation. Who to trust? He pondered as he stared at the Hokage stone faces. His eyes landed on Tsunade's face and a light bulb turned on in his head. That's it, Tsunade could help them, and she was the Hokage. No one would dare question her authority now. To plan how to get to her. Boruto, Sarada yelled in his ear, startling him. Geez, I've been calling out your name for like 5 minutes straight. What are you spaced out for? She pouted angrily. I was thinking of a strategy, he explained as they walked back to the wagon. Graf and Zari were talking to one of the shinobi who guarded the gate. It seemed that they were explaining why there were 2 bruised teenagers and 1 sleeping one with them. It must be a fun conversation, a strategy. Sarada tilted her head in confusion. It's something I learned from watching Shikadai, Boruto told her as he leaned his back against the wagon's side. Always have a game plan, never go into enemy territory without one enemy territory. It's Konoha. Sarada looked even more confused. I mean, I know we're in the past and all, but why do we need to treat this like an infiltration mission? Boruto pointed at her exactly where in the past it's a different village from what we know. Everything is different here, the layout, the shops, the people. Remember, this is a time of war, the security is much tighter than in our time and they're much more suspicious of strangers. What will they do when 3 odd-looking strangers suddenly appear in the village looking totally lost? He asked her. Sarada's eyes widened in realization. They'll think we're enemy spies. Boruto nodded. Exactly, that's why I'm planning to go talk with Granny Tsunade as soon as possible. With Lady Tsunade? Why? Well, if there's one person we can trust with the information of us being from the future, it's the Hokage. I have some ties with her, so maybe I can pull some strings in the name of nepotism. That's a terrible plan, Boruto. Sarada shook her head. You're forgetting Lady Tsunade doesn't know who you are yet, and remember how much you look exactly like Lord Seventh at this age. She'll think it's some kind of trick. We need to get some proof. We are who we say we are. Boruto nodded. Sarada's plan sounded a lot smarter than his, and we need to think about what we are going to do with Himawari. Sarada reminded him seriously. How much can that girl sleep? She looked amazed at Himawari's snooze prowess. Boruto shrugged. It must be the after effect of the destruction. She fought a lot, saw a lot of deaths as well. I think she's as exhausted mentally as she is physically. Sarada's gaze clouded. Yeah, I can understand that. Both of them stood silent for a moment, each with their own thoughts of family, of friends, of home. Hey you guys, Zari appeared from behind the wagon. Daddy says we can go in the village now, so you need to get back on the wagon. Snapping out of their thoughts, they smiled at her coming. They boarded the wagon again, and it slowly rolled into the village through the oh-so-familiar green gates. Boruto and Sarada watched the village of their childhood as it once was, with lively shops and houses spread around the streets. Boruto found it strange to watch, as a few hours ago he'd watched houses and shops in the exact same spots, only burning and broken. Everything had been in ruins. People hadn't even been screaming at that time. They'd all been dead. The air had been filled with smoke, not clear and refreshing. The sky had not been blue and bright. No smiling faces. They'd all been dead, 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 because he couldn't protect them. Dead because he'd brought danger to them. Dead because he'd been weak because of him. Hey Boruto. Sarada laid a comforting hand on his shoulder. You okay there? Yeah, he answered, his voice a bit stuffy. Just thinking. Nah. Sarada shook her head. I know you're spiraling again and blaming yourself. Boruto smiled sadly at her, his one eye seeming darker than its usual bright shade. I guess you know me too well. You're right, I'm not okay, he told her before turning his head back to the road, watching the village around them. But I can't focus on that right now, not with so much at stake. I want to be sure we're safe before he could let himself feel, was what he wanted to say. Sarada nodded, watching the road as well. I understand, I'm the same way. She squeezed his hand. Just know you can talk to me about anything, okay? Boruto nudged her with his shoulder. And you with me from now on? It's just you, me and Himawari against the world. Sarada smiled. Yeah, just us. Boruto scanned the people on the streets. Hey, do you think we'll see our parents' younger selves here? I don't know, I hope I'll see Mama around, but I'm pretty sure Papa was away from the village during this time. I wonder how old they are now. Hima will probably be pretty happy to meet Mom's younger self, and I guess meeting Dad will also be pretty cool, Boruto said, glancing at his sleeping sister. Hey Boruto, do you think we could, I don't know, start over here, like a fresh new start, a new life? Boruto stared at her for a few moments before glancing back at the Hokage stone faces. I don't know, I hope so. Out of his pouch he pulled out the headband that belonged to his master, tracing the 2 large slashes on it with his finger lingering on the vertical one. It was the one made the same day he got his scar. He placed the headband back in his pouch and gave her a half smile. I really hope so. So what do you find the strangest here? Probably the Hokage faces, he answered without much thought. It's weird seeing 5 instead of 7. Oh, because you know so much about them after spending years vandalizing them, right? She rolled her eyes. I was just making them look awesome. They were all so boring, all brown and stuff. They needed much more color. Besides, it was my gift to the people. As the most popular person in the village, they needed something from their local idol to get through the day. At that, both he and Sarada burst into laughter, with Sarada laughing so hard tears streamed from her eyes. Local idol? Yeah right, more like the local idiot. Hey guys, Graf looked over the boxes at them. We're stopping here for lunch. You're welcome to join us. There's this great ramen stand, I'm sure you're gonna like it. It's called Ichiraku. Boruto and Sarada exchanged looks. I swear that place could probably survive a shinobi war, Boruto mumbled under his breath as Sarada thanked Graf and said they'll join him and Zari for lunch. They got off the wagon and stretched their limbs, walking into the stand. After the father and daughter, they made notice of how much smaller the restaurant was compared to their time. Welcome, Iam greeted them as they took a seat on the bar stools. What would you like to? And Naruto, she yelled. When her eyes landed on Boruto, Tsuchi appeared next to her and stared at Boruto as well, both too shocked to act. Boruto internally sighed. He knew his similarity to his father would cause problems. He'd have to take care of that soon. I'm sorry ma'am, but my name is Boruto, not Naruto. You must be confusing me with someone else. Sorry about that. I am apologized. Still staring at his face. You just look so much like one of our customers. It's almost uncanny. Boruto waved her off, feeling a tad uncomfortable. He did have a scar on his right eye. Right, he wasn't imagining that. Sure, they both had blonde hair and blue eyes, but that's where it ended. Right, those people were acting like blue-eyed blondes were a rare thing. Anyway, I am tried to cut the awkward air around them. What can I get you? Graf examined the menu before turning back to her. I'll have the miso one. It tasted great the last I was here. He turned to Zari. What do you want to eat? Zari tapped her chin with her finger deep in thought. I want spicy ramen. Do you have any? The young woman gave it a thought before smiling. We have great ramen with spicy chicken noodles. Would that work? Zari smiled and clapped her hands. Yeah, I am. Turned to Boruto and Sarada. And what would you two be having? Miso ramen with chasa pork for me. Boruto said. I'll take a shio one please. I am smiled. Sure thing. She went to her father and gave him the order, and the two started working on the food. Graph turned to Boruto and Sarada. So now that we have more time, want to tell us where you're from and what were you doing in the middle of a forest with one knocked out girl? Sarada nearly choked on her water and coughed. Boruto patted on her back. When I am glanced over worriedly. Sarada straightened, wiping her mouth with the napkin. Boruto offered her. She was at a loss. We came from our village has been destroyed by bandits. Boruto intervened. I am gasped, and Tsuchi and Graf shifted uncomfortably. Me and Sarada as well as my little sister are the only survivors. Everyone else was killed by the bandits. We fought them, but they knocked out Sarada and my sister Himawari. We barely escaped. I carried them both on my back. Eventually we ran into you when you were being robbed by those bandits, so I jumped in and fought them. And during the fight Sarada woke up and helped me take them down. Himawari still hasn't woken up, though he might have left out the portal and the clone, but other than that it was the truth. Sympathy and comfort from Ayam and Tsuchi washed over them like waves. Ayam looked at them with sadness in her eyes. Oh, you poor thing. She looked like she wanted to jump over the counter and hug them. Boruto appreciated that she held back. He wasn't much of a hugging person. It's alright, you don't have to worry about us. You should definitely talk to the Hokage. I'm sure she'll let you stay in the village if you just asked her. Tsuchi recommended them as he placed their bowls of ramen on the counter. And then if you ever wanted ramen you could come here and I'll serve it to you for free. Boruto nodded. Thank you. And about talking to the Hokage, believe me, that's on top of my to-do list. All four customers clapped their hands together and said their thanks before digging in. The ramen was great, and it reminded Boruto of his father. To Sarada it reminded that time her father was in the village and Lord Seventh dragged both Uchiha and Uzumaki families to Ichiraku's. That was a pleasant evening. Halfway through their meal Boruto and Sarada noticed that Ayam was standing and watching them expectantly. Ayam-san, is something wrong? Sarada asked her. Ayam waved her off. Oh no, it's just you haven't told me what you thought of the ramen yet. Boruto and Sarada realized that in Ayam's mind it was their first time eating at Ichiraku's. They quickly swallowed and smiled at her. It tastes great, Sarada said. Yeah, it reminds me of my dad, Boruto said. Ayam clapped her hands. I'm so glad you like it. Then what would have happened if we didn't like it? Boruto dared to wonder. From his experience, women were scary and were not to be angered. He decided there were some questions that best remained unanswered if he wanted to keep living. The rest of the lunch was rather pleasant. Stories were exchanged and conversations were made. Boruto and Sarada enjoyed the relaxation very much. The owner and his daughter treated them like family and told them to stop by any time they pleased. They were both surprised by the shop owner's compassion, but grateful nonetheless. Maybe we can have a new life here after all, Sarada thought. The lunch ended with Boruto and Sarada building a strong bond with the ramen makers. Finishing the last of their meal, they got up and bid farewell to both Tsuchi and Ayam as well as Graf and Zari. Do you have to go? Zari asked the two. She seemed sad to see them leave, and Sarada felt nothing but affection to the little girl who'd taught her how to make flower crowns and had chatted with her all the way to Konoha. Crouching down, she removed one of the flower crowns she had lowered to her neck when they started eating and placed it on Zari's head. It was the one Boruto made. She patted the girl's head and smiled. We'll see you the next time you visit, okay? Do you promise? Zari asked, offering up her pinky for a pinky swear. Sarada hummed in agreement. I promise. They both locked pinkies in a cute way, smiling at each other. Boruto stood from a distance and watched them smiling. He silently bid his farewell to the shop owners and Graf nodding his head curtly before going out to get the sleeping Himawari out of the wagon. Coming out of the restaurant, he noticed that the sun has begun to set. Sarada came out as well, noticing Boruto look at the sun. He looked captivated by the colors painted across the sky. Gold, yellow, orange, red, pink, purple, you know. She began. I really think We could start fresh here. He turned to her smiling. Sarada found his smile was much more captivating than the sun. I think so too. He glanced at the Hokage tower. We should probably swing by Granny Tsunade's office, to tell her that me and Hima are the future kids of the future Hokage and a former Hyuga clan heiress, and that you are the child of the future head of the Konoha hospital and the world's second best medic. She trained by herself for 3 years and of the last Uchiha survivor who has a criminal record, he said dryly. Oh, and after that we should go tell Kakashi he never gets married and spends his days competing against a green latex-wearing lunatic in a wheelchair, for funsies. Sarada laughed at that, though shivered at the thought of actually telling her eccentric silver-haired uncle such a thing. He probably wouldn't take it well. Let's not do that, but we do have to go to visit Lady Tsunade and ask her to help us, and also give her some kind of proof to convince her that we're from the future. She stopped to think for a second before turning to him again, her forehead wrinkled. Do you think she'll freak out? Boruto gave her a face that said would you, and she surmised they thought alike. The Hokage was going to break something when she found out for sure. All they needed to do was hope that they're not the things she'd want to break, but if they were going to live here they needed to tackle everything head on, full force. I'll get Hima, and then we can go. Boruto hoped that the Hokage would take a look at Himawari as well. Not that he didn't trust Sarada's judgment, but when presented with the opportunity to have the world's best medic have a look, one wouldn't turn it down. Climbing up to the wagon, he rubbed his head and looked around. Something did not feel right. Blinking, he noticed the thin blanket that covered Himawari lacked one lavender-haired girl underneath it. Himawari was not in the wagon. What the hell, Hima, where are you? Boruto spun around. What happened? Sarada appeared behind him and noticed the empty wagon. Where's Himawari? I don't know, she disappeared. Boruto was starting to panic. She was so deep asleep, though maybe someone took her. He bolted out of the wagon and into the street, scanning the faces of everyone around them. Himawari wasn't in the crowd. This is bad, he murmured. Yeah, we've got a possibly kidnapped time traveler, and if she's awake she's unaware that she's a time traveler. Sarada gulped nervously. Where the hell could she be? I don't know, but I'm sure as hell not losing my sister, kidnapped or not. Boruto made a quick hand sign and 4 clones appeared. Himawari's missing. Find her and bring her to me. They nodded and scattered in all directions. Technically she was their sister too. They were probably worried as well. Taking out the rest of their belongings from the wagon, she and Boruto took to the streets as well. But Boruto knew they wouldn't cover enough ground this way. Swiftly jumping onto a nearby lower rooftop, he began scanning the masses of people in search of his little sister. Sarada was doing the same on the opposite rooftop. Himawari, where are you? Himawari felt dizzy and nauseous. She was disoriented, tired, and confused. So confused she'd woken up in a strange wagon, and she wondered where she was before realizing she was in an unfamiliar place and attempted to escape immediately. Now she'd been wandering these foreign streets completely baffled as to what to do next. Where am I? She asked out loud. She felt helpless, lost, not sure where to go or who to find. She was so tired, all she wanted was to close her eyes. Her body hurt, she was filthy, she wanted to sleep forever, preferably in a bed, but more than anything else she wanted her big brother. She wanted him to comfort her and tell her everything was okay and that she could rest. She wanted her family. Wandering along some side streets for what seemed like an eternity, she finally arrived at a large house. It was a very nice house, and it had a huge wall surrounding it, but the more she tried to focus on the details, her sight lost focus and she began to sway from side to side. The house was so familiar in its air, she briefly wondered how she ended up there from all places, but decided it didn't matter. All that mattered now was sleep. Yes, sleep sounded lovely. Right about now she noticed a big shady tree at a playground nearby. She stumbled to it, barely managing to walk anymore. She felt ever dizzier, and her vision got blurrier. She sighed in relief before collapsing to the ground unconscious. The leaves from the tree twirled in the air as they fell and coated the girl's hair that already had a small sunflower tucked in it. A few other leaves fell from one of the branches, but before they could reach Himawari, a sudden wind carried them all the way to the big house's doorsteps. The sign above the door marked the house as the property of none other than the prestigious Hyuga clan. If someone were to tell Niji all that would happen to him today, he would have punched them in the gut and locked himself up in his room until the weekend came. It all started with the training exercise. Oh, the cursed training exercise. Mike Guy had decided that their team needed a little bit more youthfulness in their dynamics, so at the crack of dawn the 3 of them stood in front of the green beast of Konoha on the training ground, waiting to be youthified. By him was that even a real word, seeing as he and Ten were normal, they'd been less than happy about waking up so early and getting a full shot of the Guy-Lee duo shenanigans before breakfast. Niji had been extremely on edge since Guy had declared today a day of youth and spring and renewal, i.e. a day of sore muscles and migraines. They started out with basic warm-up exercises, 200 push-ups, 100 sit-ups and 50 laps around the training ground. By the end, Niji felt like cursing the gods. Kicking a puppy and drowning himself in the river for good measure, and Niji Hyuga did not believe in suicide nor kicking puppies. Ten wasn't much better off mumbling death threats directed at their sensei and teammate. He swore he caught her mentioning among other things target practice poison, and much to his horror, castration. Ten was not a morning person. After their warm-up, Mike Guy announced they would be having a four-way spar, yelling something about how sparring with your comrades was the youthful way of life, and Lee agreeing with him, saying that the springtime of youth was always in his heart. They started hugging after that and calling each other's names. Niji knew by now to avert his gaze from their embrace. He had already experienced hallucinations when watching them do it in the past, such as seeing a sunset and a cliff with waves crashing over it behind them. As they went about their manly hug the first time he watched them do it, he called in sick the next day and spent the remaining hours of his wake screaming into a pillow. It's not that he was really opposed to public displays of affections or anything, but Guy and Lee were a special case when it came to those things. If only Naruto was there with him, and only because of his loud voice and hyperactive nature, were just a tad more bearable in comparison to his sensei and Lee. After Guy and Lee's long-winded hug, they began the four-way sparring session. It was harder than usual, but nothing that his Byakugan couldn't handle. It was these kinds of situations that the dojutsu was meant for. Anyways, Ten had come up with a new weapon trick where she used 3 scrolls at once and threw them in 3 different directions, managing to hurl weapons at the 3 of them at the same time. Niji used a rotation move and easily dodged her weapons, only to be surprise attacked by Lee, who sent a powerful kick in the direction of his face, barely deflecting Lee's leg in time. He dove under it as Ten threw a kunai his way. Before going back to her fight against Guy, Lee then launched at her and threw a punch at her shoulder, which left him completely open and in Niji's range. But before he could enact one of his clan's techniques, Mike Guy flew in with a dynamic kick, forcing Niji to change direction and fend for himself against his sensei. Their sparring session went on for about 2 hours, earning them bruises from various attacks and cuts from Tenten's weapons, before even Lee became somewhat exhausted, panting heavily. The 2 Chunin and 2 Jonin collapsed on the ground. Well, Guy didn't exactly collapse as much as he fell onto his hands and did a quick set of push-ups. Ten kicked Lee in the shin when he suggested they'd follow their sensei's example, and if Niji wasn't suffering from exhaustion and a light migraine, he might have joined her in doing so. Even after drinking up all the water he'd brought with him, it didn't quite quench his thirst. Their training had ended at around 10 in the morning. Ten and Lee left to their respective homes, and Guy went to bother his rival Kakashi for a match against him. Niji was relaxing on a bench next to the training ground, sitting under the shade of a tree and wondering what would be the most effective way to soothe his headache. Eyes closed, he heard the footsteps of someone approaching. He barely had the energy to open his eyes, let alone stand and see who was coming his way. Straining his ears, he managed to distinguish the sound of a rustling plastic bag. Probably a grocery one. The footsteps were getting closer, and a familiar presence washed over him. A feeling he knew all too well crept upon him, and he prepared himself for what he knew was coming next. Niji Nizan Hanabi called her cousin. He sighed, knowing there was no escaping his fate. Not this time. Hello, Hanabi-sama. He greeted his cousin, slowly opening his eyes. The brown-haired girl stood in front of the bench. He rested on a grocery bag on her hand. What's up, cousin? Nothing much, he said, lifting an eyebrow at her bag. What's in the bag? Oh, this. Hanabi raised her bag to get a better look at it. I just thought that you'd be thirsty after practice, so when I was out buying ice cream, I also got you a water bottle. Now believing his cousin an angel, Naji gratefully accepted the cool water bottle she handed him, opening it immediately and downing its contents. Hanabi parked herself next to him, taking out 2 frozen ice creams and offering him one at his stomach now empty. Niji accepted the ice cream as well, and the 2 spent a few minutes in silence eating their frozen treats. Hanabi licked at her cone happily while Niji simply took small bites of it. Both of them shared the same love for vanilla blueberry ice cream for some unknown reason. Since neither of them had really given much thought to it, they just saw it one time when they were out shopping and gravitated towards it, and had ever since bought it every chance they got. They didn't complain, since it tasted really good, but the taste was definitely a unique one. Niji kinda thought that the ice cream was a lot like Hinata, sweet with little bursts of surprises. It fit Hinata's description in his eyes quite well. After they finished their ice cream, Niji felt much better. All he wanted to do now was go home and have a cup of tea outside, maybe sit in front of the koi pond and read a book. Yeah, that sounded perfect. Hey Niji niece, and Hanabi began drawling her words, and he knew there was a reason why she was suddenly so nice to him now. That you're rested up, you don't mind going shopping with me now, do you? A sneaky glint shone in her eyes. Niji groaned internally. Going shopping with his younger cousin usually meant that he had to carry all her bags for her and wait for hours for her to pick some piece of clothing she was never going to wear anyway. But she did do something nice for you. His internal compass reminded him, shouldn't you return the favor sometimes? I hate it when I'm right. Niji thought, fine, I'll go shopping with you. He gave in to the Hyuga heiress. Hanabi jumped for joy and danced around them, hands in the air. Yeah, we're gonna have so much fun. She grabbed Niji's hand and began to drag him behind her. Let's go, cousin. Niji sighed. This was going to be a long day. He could already feel his migraine coming back. A few hours and 13 shopping bags later, Hanabi and the ever-wary Niji made their way back to the Hyuga compound. Niji sometimes wondered whether Hanabi saw him as a servant or worse, a slave. Sure felt that way. As much as he loved his cousin, she was headstrong and forceful. She was so different from her older sister, one could barely tell they were related. Hinata was shy and gentle. Hanabi was confident and brash. He supposed that was why Hanabi was chosen to be the heiress instead of Hinata. From the clan's point of view, Hinata didn't have the backbone to lead the stoic and strong Hyuga clan. That was where they were wrong in his opinion, as Hinata was stronger than she let on. He knew it. Hanabi knew it. Hayashi knew it. Hell, even Naruto knew it. The only ones who didn't were the clan elders, or as Niji secretly called them, the vaulters. They were truly the horrible ones. Say, Hanabi-sama. Niji remembered something. Where's Hinata-sama today? Ne-sama. Hanabi sent him a surprised look, tilting her head and tapping her chin with her index finger. I think she went out this morning to the training grounds. She said she wanted to work on a jutsu she's developing. Hinata was developing a jutsu. What kind? How would it work? Why hadn't she come to him for help? That last question took him by surprise. Did it really bother him that Hinata had not come to him in search of help? Why did that bother him so much? Because you want her to rely on you, because you want her to trust you. Yes, that was it. He and Hinata might have made their peace, but he still felt like they were strangers because of all the time he spent treating her like garbage. When he was still full of anger, he'd ended up pushing her away, and although he apologized and she forgave him, there was still a wall between them, not only between them but also between Hinata, her father, and Hanabi. As much as each party wanted to try and break down the walls, fear prevented them from doing anything about it. While she'd forgiven them all for their mistreatment, it didn't mean that things would ever be like they were before. That was what Niji feared most, because he was afraid she'd reject his attempts at reconnection just as he did with her all those years ago, and he knew that that was also what made Hayashi and Hanabi afraid to try. Hinata hadn't said outright that she didn't want anything to do with them, but she also didn't say anything else, so none of them knew what she was thinking. Forget Hanabi being terrifying. Hinata was truly the scariest person he had ever met. It was always the quiet ones, wasn't it? The wall grew bigger by the day, and if no one made a move to break it, it would eventually become impenetrable. If only he dared to take that step, to reach out his hand and ask. When had he become so insecure? Look, Niji in the old playground. Hanabi pointed at the place from their childhood. It was a playground that belonged to the Hyuga compound. Hanabi spent much of her free time on the swings and monkey bars. Niji had some memories of going down the slides, his father watching. Hanabi ran ahead to the monkey bars, leaving Niji with all the shopping bags. Since they seldom took that road home, they didn't often have the chance to walk by the playground, but because of a new boutique that opened up recently that Hanabi wanted to visit, they ended up changing their course home. Sighing at Hanabi's childish mannerism, Niji placed the shopping bags near the swings of the playground and walked after Hanabi. A small wind began to blow, making the leaves of the big tree at the corner of the playground to rustle as they moved. Niji looked at the tree's top, enjoying the breeze. Hanabi was climbing the monkey bars when the wind started, but stopped in her place as it gently caressed her face. The two cousins stood, letting the wind ruffle their hair, and breathed deep the clear air. Niji closed his eyes and filled his lungs, slowly releasing the air from his mouth. His eyes opening, his gaze fixated on the tree once again, letting it wander down. He noticed something strange. Under the tree there was a girl around his age. She laid on the ground in a less than conventional way to sleep. Eyes widening, he rushed towards her. Hanabi noticed his quick movements, and her gaze darted to the unconscious girl as well. She quickly jumped off the monkey bars and ran over to her. Niji slid to his knees and gently picked up the girl's upper body into his arms. She was definitely unconscious and seemingly having passed out exactly under the tree, his fingers brushing her lavender-colored hair out of her face. He and Hanabi examined her face further. She had notable 2 whisker marks on each cheek, but overall her face was pretty cute. Her cheeks were puffed a little as she breathed slowly. Hanabi crouched down next to him and pulled out a handkerchief, wiping the filth off the girl's face with it. She examined the body of the girl and noticed the many bruises and cuts on her arms and legs. "She's injured," Hanabi gasped. Carrying the girl in his arms, he got up. "We should get her to a hospital," he told his brown-haired cousin. Hanabi nodded. "You go ahead and take her there." She went and grabbed the shopping bags. "I'll put those inside and tell father where we are so he won't worry." Niji took a long look at the girl in his arms. She had a few leaves tangled in her long hair, and together with them was a single sunflower. "A sunflower?" he wondered out loud before smiling slightly. "All right then, I suppose I'll call you Hima, at least until you'll wake up." His sweat dropped at the fact he just talked to an unconscious person and gave her a name. At that, making sure his hold on her was tight enough, Niji jumped to the nearest rooftop, making his way quickly to the Konoha hospital. While running, he didn't notice that the sunflower in the girl's hair fell down to the streets, landing on the ground just as a blonde clone passed by. The blonde clone bent down to pick up the flower that fell next to him. Examining it, he then looked up to where the flower fell from. A silhouette on the rooftops was getting farther and farther away. The clone looked to the distance and tried to tell where it was going, although the darkening sky was making it hard to see. Straining his eye, the clone managed to see the sign of the Konoha General Hospital. Of course, if someone found an injured girl wandering down the streets, they'll take her to the hospital. He had to deliver his realization to the original. About to dispel himself, the clone suddenly noticed a forgotten black hoodie and a black jacket thrown at the end of an alley. The clothes were a bit dirty and definitely did not smell pleasant, but in case of needing to hide something, those clothes would do the trick. He grabbed the clothes and set out to the direction of the hospital before stopping again, this time in front of a convenience store. An idea quickly forming in the clone's mind, he entered the store trying to make himself look innocent and in a rush, which wasn't hard to do considering he kinda was. He went straight to the store clerk and put on his most helpless face. "Excuse me." "Hello," the store clerk said. "What can I do for you today?" "Well, this is embarrassing." The clone rubbed his head. "You see, my little sister fell down and injured her knee, so I promised her I'd get her some bandages for it, but the thing is I have no money on me. Do you think you could help me out?" he asked the clerk, putting on his best worried big brother face. It was one he wore often anyways. The clerk tapped his chin in thought before shooting a look to the backroom door, which was closed. He ducked under the register counter and came up a small box of white small bandages. His hand, "Take those, just don't say I gave them to you if anyone asks." "Okay." The Boruto clone smiled at him, but inside his mind he was doing backflips in the air. This was so much better than what he hoped. "Thanks, man." He ran for the hospital. The sun was going down at an alarming rate. It would be best if he could get there before night fell. That would make his plan easier. Arriving about 5 minutes later at the hospital's entrance, the clone swiftly stuck both clothes and bandages box inside some nearby bushes. He took a few steps back and focused his gaze on the bush. He hid the stuff in memorizing it. He then made a quick hand sign and dispelled himself, sending his memories to the original. It had been around 2 hours now that Himawari had disappeared from the wagon. Boruto and Sarada had turned over almost every stone and searched every nook in the village. They had broken into a sweat, the occasional tears, and Sarada was pretty sure some of her cuts reopened and was leaking blood everywhere. Around an hour after they started searching, Boruto was starting to lose hope. They'd scanned over half the village. He honestly wished he had his father's sage mode so he could locate Himawari's chakra in seconds and go grab her already, but he would never give up. He'd turn over every stone in this enormous place twice if he had to. They were both panicked and angry. Sarada, while not being related to Himawari through blood, had come to form a deep bond with the girl. Over the years they used to go shopping together with the other girls, and sometimes just the two of them. The spar as well, testing out the Byakugan against the Sharingan. So many shared secrets, laughter, and memories were between them that Sarada felt like Himawari was one of the few that actually knew her. They had a strong sisterly bond, and losing her like this in the tremendous village had frightened the Uchiha heiress beyond words. What could have happened to the Uzumaki girl if she had woken up and an enemy appeared? He'd have to be quite the formidable foe to best Himawari in a hand-to-hand combat if she had woken up, but there was no enemy. Then she would probably assume she was kidnapped since she had woken up in an unfamiliar location, and what does one do when kidnapped? Try to escape. So if Sarada's hunch was right, Himawari was somewhere in the village, hurt and scared and confused since she wouldn't recognize this place. Himawari was Boruto's precious little sister, the only family he had left, the one who understood him better than anyone else, and the one who acted as his rock, his anchor to the world. She was his voice of reason and the one he confided in, but even though she was smarter and more capable than he would ever be, she was still the younger sibling, and he felt it was his duty As an older brother to protect her, he'd promised everyone he'd take care of her from now on, and here he was barely day one on the job and she had already gone missing in this ginormous Konoha village of the past. He felt like crying, and Boruto Uzumaki did not cry. It was already getting dark out and almost all of his clones had already dispelled, all except for one. Boruto Sarada turned to face him. What is it? He glanced her way swiftly before going back to scanning the street in front of them. Himawari wasn't there either, so the blonde jumped back onto the rooftops and continued making his way through the village. He froze in place. Sarada, who had been a few steps ahead of him, stopped as well and looked at him over her shoulder. Is everything okay? She asked the last clone. He dispelled, Boruto said, still processing his clone's memories, and he found Himawari. That's great, Sarada exclaimed. Where is she now? The Konoha General Hospital. The clone saw someone carrying her there. So I was right, Sarada thought victoriously. Boruto's face immediately furrowed though. Wait, it might not be her though. Sarada was confused. She was sure her theory was correct. How come the only clue we have that this is Himawari is that a sunflower fell from the person who was carrying? Who could potentially be Himawari? Boruto explained, rubbing his head. So our only clue is a flower that fell from the sky. Sarada summed it up, lifting an eyebrow. It sounded sketchy. Boruto shrugged and started heading toward the Konoha hospital. Hey, it's better than nothing. He jumped to the next rooftop. Sarada was left standing there staring at the blonde's back. Remind me again why I blush around that guy, she mumbled to herself. Not even her own mind could explain why he made her so flustered. Sure, he had his moments, but most of the time he was an idiot. Oh well, maybe she'd find out one day. Hey, wait up, Boruto, why are there so many people in the hospital at this hour? Neji wondered as he walked into the lobby with Hima in his arms. Most of those in the waiting room were people who were waiting for checkups or prescription medication. Neji wasn't sure what to do with an unconscious girl in his arms, an empty receptionist desk, and a lot of sick and injured people surrounding them. Holding Hima closer to his chest, he scanned the bustling lobby for a doctor or a nurse that might be able to help him. That's when he noticed a pink bob among the crowd. Neji smiled. Finally, some good luck, Sakura. He called out the pink-haired medic's name. Ever since Sakura began to apprentice under Tsunade, she'd been taking shifts in the hospital and helping doctors and nurses while learning how to take care of different kinds of injuries and diseases. She was the only Team 7 member still in the village. The other two were either on a training trip or a hunt for power with a man that may or may not be a pedophile. He had to give her props for still staying in the village and not going off on some vendetta of her own. God knows she had her reasons to do so as well. Sakura made her way to Neji with a pleasant expression on her face, though it soon disappeared when she noticed the unconscious girl in his arms. She beckoned for a staff member to attend to them immediately. What happened? Sakura asked. Hanabi and I found her on our way back to the compound, Neji explained as calmly as he could. She was lying unconscious under a tree in the playground behind the clan compound. She seemed injured, so I brought her here. Hanabi will be here soon as well. Sakura nodded as the staff member she called earlier brought a gurney to the scene. She beckoned the brown-haired Hyuga to place the unconscious girl on it, to which he did, albeit unwillingly for some reason unknown to him. You didn't happen to catch her name, did you? Sakura shot a glance at Neji. We need one, or else her name would be unknown, and I don't think she'll appreciate being called that. Neji opened his mouth to say he didn't know the girl's name, but stopped himself. He had already given her a name, right? Hima, he said. That's her name, Hima. Then Sakura nodded to the medic beside her to take the patient away. They were going to have her scanned for any broken bones and have a full routine checkup. Are you going to stay here? He nodded and crossed his arms. All right, Sakura said. Go to the waiting area, then I'll keep you posted as soon as I get her data. And with that she walked away after the gurney and the medic. Neji stood there for a moment silent before going off to the waiting area and sitting down at the first open seat. He found everything was, well, not quiet, since the lobby was still booming with patients and staff, but that sound was becoming more like white noise. Indeed, everything was quiet until they barged in through the doors like maniacs and started to raise havoc. Seeing as the staff was either too busy with patients or scared to stop those two, Neji reluctantly got up from his chair and went over to the front entrance where they stood. He was going to do both him and the hospital a favor by kicking those two out. As he got close to the two of them, he found the young man who was wearing a black hoodie and it had covered his head, grabbing a staff member's arm and not letting go. Although her more than few efforts to pull away from him, the girl behind the assaulter was also wearing a black jacket and scanning the lobby while her partner held the medic's arm in his hand, not letting go. Yet it seemed like he was trying to ask him something, but the man was too scared of a stranger grabbing his arm to actually listen. The girl in the meanwhile had noticed Niji making his way over to them. Her eyes widened in what seemed like recognition. Nevertheless, she quickly nudged her partner in the ribs with her elbow and gestured with her head to Niji, who was almost at their side by now. The young man didn't seem to listen, still trying to ask something of the man in his hold, a girl with a ripped yellow hoodie and a skirt. Is she here? Did someone bring her here? The hoodie-covered teen tried to ask the man. Get off me. Already in a final attempt at getting loose, the man finally pulled his arm out of the young man's hold, getting away from them as quick as possible. Niji was still shocked at the description the hoodie-covered boy gave the man. It sounded exactly like the girl he brought in. Excuse me. Niji politely turned to the boy. Yeah, what? The boy gave him a quick glance before going back to scanning the lobby like his partner before snapping his gaze back to Niji like a rocket, his face revealing shock now that he was finally looking at Niji. The brown-haired Hyuga was able to see the boy's full face. He had 2 white bandages covering his cheeks and a lone scar stretching from right under his eyebrow down to his cheek right across the boy's right eye. His left one, though, it was a blue Niji had seen only once elsewhere, though maybe a tad bluer than what Niji knew. It seemed like the boy was evaluating Niji just like Niji was him. As the boy straightened up, his hoodie came off, revealing a mop of spiky golden hair. Niji's face showed pure shock. The boy, who seemed around his age, looked exactly like Naruto, well, minus the scar and bandages. They both watched each other in shock. At truly words of wisdom, the raven-haired girl next to the Naruto look-alike facepalmed. Oh, for God's sake, this is ridiculous, she yelled, seemingly exhausted. The boy next to her was still staring at Niji, although now it seemed as if he was trying to commit the brown-haired male to memory. I'm sorry about my friend here, the girl said. He's an idiot. She then proceeded to kick the blonde ferociously in the shin, jolting him awake from his shocked state and making him kneel over in pain. What were you saying? She asked Niji sweetly, as if nothing happened. Niji shook his head to clear out his confusion. Right, well, I overheard the description you gave that man and I couldn't help but compare it to a girl I brought in less than 10 minutes ago. The blonde immediately stopped fussing over his hurt leg and stood up, hope burning in his eye. Did she have sort of black lavender hair? Niji nodded yes, and she had a sunflower in her head, but it had fallen off when I was carrying her. The blonde seemed so relieved and happy, he looked like he was ready to melt on the floor and just be done for the day. The girl, on the other hand, was still tensed a bit. So, where is she now? A medic took her to get a scan and a checkup. They should be keeping me updated. He glanced at the blonde. You probably want to stay as well, right? The blonde and Raven nodded, and the three proceeded to go back to the waiting area and sit down, the two of them sitting exactly across from Niji. The blonde seemed to be having a difficult time trying not to look directly at Niji, who was staring him down with his unbreaking gaze. I forgot to ask. Niji decided to break the ice. How do you know the girl exactly? The blonde's eyebrows raised and he honestly seemed surprised at the question. She's my little sister. Niji was definitely curious now. The girl and the boy looked almost nothing alike aside from maybe their face shape. Honestly, the girl looked more like a Hyuga to Niji other than a random person. He actually wondered about that for a brief while, since he thought her being a Hyuga would explain why she fell unconscious behind their compound. Did they give her a name or just went with unknown? In her chart, the raven-haired, bespectacled girl next to the blonde asked Niji, surprising him with the amount of knowledge she had about the hospitals working. I gave her a name, Niji said slowly. I told them to call her Hima. Hima's brother's eyebrows raised so high up Niji was pretty sure even the boy's sealed shut eye would soon open and widen with shock, his expression almost comical. What did surprise him so much anyway? You named her Hima, the blonde repeated after him. Why? Niji tilted his head. I just saw a sunflower in her hair, so I called her Hima. The bespectacled girl smiled widely and touched the flower crown that was situated around her neck. We'll have to thank Sari the next time we see her, then she told the blonde beside her, who nodded in agreement. She then turned to face Niji. The girl's name is Himawari, she informed him. It's amazing how close you were to her actual name. He shrugged. It was pretty uncanny how he almost got her actual name right. Speaking of names, he realized, you still haven't told me yours. That seems to have shaken the blonde out of his trance. He blinked at Niji for a few moments before answering. You're right. He pointed at the girl beside him. This is Sarada, and my name's Boruto. Niji nodded at him. It's a pleasure to meet you too, he said. My name is Niji Hyuga. Sarada suddenly seemed to be choking laughter while Boruto mumbled something under his breath. Niji could have sworn was you don't say. Niji Nizan Hanabi called him as she walked towards them from the lobby. Hanabi-sama, you're here. Niji greeted his cousin. Sarada was now actively trying to hold in her laughter, and Boruto facepalmed, muttering something under his breath again. Oh, Hanabi noticed the two. Who are they? Those are the girl's brother and his friend Boruto and Sarada. Niji introduced them. You two meet my cousin Hanabi. Hyuga-sama. Hanabi curtly bowed her head at them, and Sarada, who was wiping her tears, smiled at her. It's a pleasure to meet you, Hanabi-san. She then elbowed Boruto in his ribs. He yelped in pain at her act and rubbed his now sore ribcage. Yeah, it's a pleasure and whatnot. He sent a quick glance at Hanabi before his eyes focused on Niji. How long ago did they take Himawari? Around 20 minutes, maybe a bit more, Niji told Boruto, who was still rubbing his ribs. Did you have to elbow me there, Sarada? Boruto complained. I'm pretty sure that rib was cracked before you went and broke it. You're injured. Concern washed over Niji. The blonde waved him off. Just some bruises and cuts, he said. Maybe a cracked rib or two, nothing that won't heal in a few days. It was then Sarada's turn to facepalm. You idiot, she told Boruto before forcefully removing his hand from the sore area and rolling up with short up to the ribcage. Here, let me take a look. Hey Sarada. Boruto's cheeks flushed as Sarada started to inspect his torso. What are you doing to base? Niji froze. That form of speech he had heard it before. Hanabi, on the other hand, was enjoying the show so far, moving from her seat to get a better look at the fit and slim torso of the blonde, a smirk on her face as she poked the blonde in his side. Well, I can see why you rushed to lift his shirt, Sarada-san, her smirk getting bigger. This is certainly an eye-catching body you got there, Mr. Niji groaned internally at his cousin's misdoings and grabbed her shirt's collar, dragging her back to her seat. Sarada's face was as red as a tomato and she jumped away from Boruto like she was burnt and held her hands close to her chest. Boruto, on the other hand, seemed disturbed greatly by the comment Hanabi made on his body and also a bit flushed-cheeked from her teasing of Sarada. He rolled down his shirt and made sure not to make eye contact with Sarada, staring off into space in the opposite direction from her. Niji sent a disapproving side glance at the heiress of his clan's main house, but she just looked at him with a totally innocent look on her face, seeming like she couldn't hurt a fly. He didn't buy it, but decided to drop it for now. He'd be sure to tell her his thoughts about her actions later on. Hanabi got up from her seat, attracting Niji's attention towards her. Where are you going to get food? She answered, taking out her wallet. I'm starving. Anyone want anything? I'll come with you. A much more calmed down Sarada offered. I'll get you something as well. Boruto followed them with his gaze until they disappeared out of sight. He then glanced at the clock that hung above the reception desk inside. He kept tapping his fingers against the chair's armrest repeatedly, and Niji imagined he must be worried about his sister. I'm sure she's going to be fine. Niji tried to reassure him. The medics here are highly skilled. They wouldn't let anything bad happen to her. Boruto smiled at him and his tense shoulder seems to relax slowly as he expelled air from his lungs. Yeah, he said, sticking his hands in his pocket. I know she will. It's getting pretty late. Did you tell your parents? Where are you already? Niji asked him. Boruto froze, fists clenching and his jaw tightened. Our parents, they died, he admitted sadly, looking at the ground. Niji wanted to slap himself for his question. True, he wouldn't have known before he asked, but it still seemed like a sensitive subject and he felt like a jerk for asking. He didn't mean to bring up painful memories. He was just worried about the siblings' well-being since one was in the hospital and both not looking like they were locals from the village. How were they staying alive in the village? Were they all at an inn, or did they have an apartment? How long had they been in the village? Deciding this question is not as invasive as his previous one, he tried asking it. How long have the three of you been in the village? Niji asked the blonde. Boruto took a swift glance at the clock before replying, about 5 hours. He laughed at Niji's surprised face. We arrived with some merchants while we stopped to eat. Himawari woke up from her nap and probably didn't recognize where she was, so she ran away. We've been looking for her for a few hours when one of my shadow clones picked up the sunflower that fell from her hair and saw you heading to the hospital with her. So Sarada and I rushed over here as soon as we found out. Niji raised an eyebrow. You created a shadow clone? Could this guy be any more like Naruto? Yeah, Boruto seemed momentarily confused at Niji's curiosity before widening his eyes. My dad picked up a few ninjutsu here and there. He taught me some when I was young, he rambled, quickly explaining himself nervously, though Niji couldn't understand why he was. It was quite common for people living close to a ninja village to learn a few jutsus from shinobi. They needed it mostly to protect themselves and their businesses were back. Hanabi's voice suddenly came from beside him. She and Sarada were each holding 2 sandwiches in one of their hands and a cup of coffee on the other. Sarada went and sat down next to Boruto, handing him a sandwich and opening the wraps of her own. Hanabi plopped down next to Niji and threw his sandwich at his lap before loudly seeping from her cup. Niji just rolled his eyes at her antics before biting into his sandwich. He watched as Boruto unwrapped his as well and took a large bite out of it. Sarada took smaller bites than him but still seemed like she was enjoying herself. She started sipping from her beverage when a familiar female voice from their side spoke. Excuse me. All heads snapped towards the source of the voice, seeing a certain pink-haired girl standing in front of them. Niji nodded at her. Sakura. Sarada spit and mid-drink. Boruto burst into laughter at the sight of his friend choking on her drink, the first genuine smile on his face since Niji have met him. Although he was happy to see the young man relax more, he couldn't help but notice He really does look like Naruto when he laughs like that. Sakura seemed like she didn't know how to take the two's extreme reaction. To her arrival, the blonde one looked almost identical to her blonde knucklehead of a teammate with his blue eye and blonde spiky hair, but a few other features of his face distinguished him from the Uzumaki she knew, especially the large scar that stretched over his right eye. Remembering suddenly why she came here in the first place, but as she didn't know them, she decided to ignore the two's sudden outburst and turn to Niji, whom she came to deliver the news to. I have Hima's results, she informed the Hyuga, but before I tell you them, did any of the family members show up? I'm her family member. The relaxed blonde's expression and demeanor changing into a serious one in the drop of a hat as he got up with the speed of lightning. Is she alright? He proceeded to question the medic. Well, she suffered from a lot of bruising and cuts, and 2 of her ribs were cracked. Sakura read from the chart in her hands. The blonde's expression became grim, and his fists tightened, but Sakura continued in a much cheerier tone. We were able to heal all of it. I would recommend keeping her here for another night for observation and rest, but other than that she's completely fine. The blonde sighed a sigh of relief and smiled back at her. Thank you, Sakura-san. Sakura's eyes widened in shock. How did you know that was my name? The blonde seemed surprised as well. Well, as lone, I darted all over the place nervously. I saw it on your name tag. His answer came out hesitantly, almost unheard. Sakura relaxed as she took a glance at her lab coat front, where her name was written on a silver name tag. Oh right, she rubbed her head. Sorry, I guess the double shift makes me kinda lose it. I'm still kinda new to this whole hospital business. He waved her off. It's fine. He smiled kind-heartedly at her. I think that anyone who doesn't sleep for a while becomes kinda stressed. He sent a meaningful look at his friend, who rolled her eyes. I said I was sorry, she exclaimed. Sorry doesn't fix the damage you did to my arm. I had to stay at home for a week, he told her, his expression changing into something more teasing. Sarada puffed her cheek. That was 3 years ago. Grow up, Boruto. Boruto laughed at her comment. Right, sorry. Sakura and Niji watched the exchange quietly, noticing how close the two seemed to be. Sarada seemed to have managed to change Boruto's serious and grim demeanor to a teasing one in a heartbeat, and their little banter seemed like a normal occurrence between them. Must be nice, he mused. Oh right, Sakura interrupted them. Since she's stable right now, you can go see her if you'd like. He and Sarada moved from the chairs towards Sakura, who was about to guide them to her patient's room. Boruto looked behind him at the still-seated Niji and Hanabi. Aren't you guys coming too? He asked them. Niji blinked. Can we? Boruto smiled at him. Sure, I'm sure Himawari would like to meet you too. Having nothing to lose, Niji and Hanabi rose from their chairs and followed Sakura together with Boruto and Sarada down the hall to Himawari's room. The walk to the room was quiet yet packed with nervous energy. To each of their own thoughts, they had all wondered how the lavender-haired girl was doing. Even though Sakura said she was fine now, she still had to stay another night in the hospital for observation. As they made turns and wandered through the hospital, none of them paying attention to their surroundings, the sense of nervousness had amplified and was washing over them like waves. They finally reached a corridor with a few closed doors, and at each door led to a different patient's room. Sakura walked to the last door in the hallway, a door numbered 2610, and placed her hand on the handle. Oh, she suddenly turned to the group behind her. I forgot to tell you guys, but she's already awake.